Mm.
But I am hopeful, Tony, because I think that this is a very unnatural way that we have come to live. And that's why it's important for listeners to understand that we're not
Mm.
pointing fingers at people. We're not saying that you're a bad human being for the choices you might have made. We are saying, what has the accumulation of these choices in the direction of the sexual revolution
Yeah.
meant for our societies and for individual happiness?
Yeah.
I think if we approach the question that way, we will see where the correction will come from. It will come from individuals in possession of the idea that, hey, maybe there's a better way of doing this.
Mary Eberstadt, it's a real privilege to talk to you today, an absolute honour, in fact. You've said I can call you Mary, so I'll do that. Before we begin, would you like to just say a quick hello to our listeners and our viewers?
Yes, hello. I'm delighted to be on the show and to be talking to the good people of Great Britain.
Well, great. And it's lovely to talk to you. Now, I think, as we said before we started recording, I could spend my whole interview just introducing you, such as the prolific nature of your academic accolades, your writing background, your commenting globally on the international stage on all things theological, sociological, so many different topics. Now, the things I wanted to focus on today, and I would encourage people, first of all, to go and look you up because you write widely and on a significant number of matters. And the things I wanted to talk to you today, obviously, we're the Coalition for Marriage, and we've got tens of thousands of supporters from all faiths and none who promote and support this thing, man-woman marriage. Yes, we know other things take place in society. Of course they do. But we think man-woman marriage is significant. We think it's unique. We think it brings something to the table that nothing else does. And we think that the way it's been disregarded, relatively speaking, in society isn't doing society any good. And we would like to know how we can fix that in a way that doesn't offend other people's sensitivities, etc., because it's really, really important. Now, having said that, your two books I mentioned there, Adam and Eve After the Pill and Adam and Eve After the Pill Revisited. First of all, I'd recommend people read both. One isn't just a redraft of the other. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, first of all, but I think the first one is more about the implications of the sexual revolution on a personal basis. So that's men, women, children, whereas the second one seems to look rather than micro, but on a macro basis. So looking at institutions like the church, like government, like society, and the wider implications, sociological implications, as opposed to the personal implications. So they're both very, very relevant. Which have I summarized them correctly?
Absolutely, Tony. Thank you. The books are 10 years apart, and the first takes what I call a microscopic look at the sexual revolution, that is, its effects on men, women, and children. And the second book opens the aperture to take in the wider frame to say, what is this revolution doing to Western society, Western politics, and Christianity?
I wanted to ask you a few. And I've listened to you discussing those books several times in several different fora, and obviously I've read a lot of your material, Mary. And what I don't want to do is get you to repeat stuff that people can go and listen to elsewhere. But I'm interested in the UK specific context. We've and it's not unique by any means, but from a UK specific context, we seem to have an outbreak not of toxic masculinity, but of something called toxic empathy. And we've got this situation almost where, in order not to offend anyone, we'll accept anything. And as a result, we've got things like we had some research published recently in the UK that 90% of the wealthiest mums are married, only 20% of the poorest mums are married. And it reminded me of a film I watched when I was young, whether I should have watched it when I was a little boy, whether I should have watched it or not, I don't know, but the original Blade Runner. And there was you had these robots in the film, and the way to, because they were so human-like, the way to tell a robot from a real person was to ask them about their mother, because that was a question designed to provoke an emotional response. And it almost feels to me today like we've got two cultures. We've got the culture that grows up in a happy, secure family, and the culture that doesn't, and doesn't enjoy the benefits of those things. And I wonder if you could just, from your point of view, elaborate on whether that's what you're seeing too.
Yes, absolutely, Tony. And let me open by making a point that I make in both those books because I think it's important. when we talk about not wanting people to feel judged and not wanting people to feel badly because of these subjects that are before us, I really feel that to the marrow. And I try hard to emphasize over and over that we are talking right now and in these two books about trends that are affecting Western society, I think for the worse. And that's what the evidence shows. It's not a personal opinion.
Mm.
And it's important to understand that now so many people have been affected by the sexual revolution, by the breakup of families, by the failure of families to form in the first place, that many people don't understand anymore why people lived in families to begin with. So
Mm.
there's been this act of forgetting. We human beings don't live very long. We forget very important things. We've only recently discovered, for example, how the Romans built what they built with the kind of concrete they used. We can forget all kinds of things. We don't know how to make stained glass the way medieval artists did. And so, what I think we're seeing now, Tony, is a forgetting of elemental human truths, like in what social situations do human beings thrive?
Mm.
The answer to that for most people throughout history has been within the protection of the family. So, in the statistics you're pointing to right now, in the fact that better off women uh, tend to be married, tend to have personal wealth, these two things going together, of course, which is a separate subject.
Mm.
But the fact that people in those same upper classes tend to say that whatever other people want to do is fine is one instantiation and a particularly crippling one, I think, of what I'm describing, this forgetting. It is not enough to say what makes me thrive is irrelevant to the rest of you. What makes me thrive is something totally subjective. No, what is making the people in our upper classes thrive very often is that they are living in stable situations anchored by marriage. And
Mm.
so the work that you do and that the coalition does bringing the benefits of marriage to other people, I think is especially critical at a time when people at the upper end of society seem to have abandoned both their understanding of what's important about marriage and their concern for what's happening at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And not only there,
Mm.
the deleterious trends that we see shoot through societies, through the lower classes, middle classes, and upper classes. But you're quite right. They are most concentrated at the lower end.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I suppose we could we could go on not only about the facts, but the fact that we live in a post-fact society. I mean, Brad Wilcox's recent book about Get Married is, just a latest example of all the positive stats associated with marriage. But Mary, nobody cares. The people who are getting married will carry on getting married, and the people who are objecting to it or wanting a different format for society will carry on doing that. So I wonder, how do we get back at the truth? How do we recover? We can't go back in time. We know that, but how do we recover the truth in a society where if you've got men and women working in an office on a laptop, well, there isn't a whole lot of difference, quite frankly. We know, you've got to go to the gym these days to see the difference between men and women because, we forget. We live in a society where men don't need to give commitment in order to get sex. It's just easy these days. We live in a society where women don't need men in order to get income. And then we even have the strange situation. There was some research I was looking at that, most women vote for Biden. Now, we don't take a political position as an organization, but you'd think that if there was a choice between the side that said, yes, a man can think he's a woman and enter into women's spaces and enter into women's sports, that wouldn't be the one that most women support. But the opposite seems to be true, especially in the US. So how do we recover this truth about the difference, first of all, between men and women?
So I think there are a couple of answers there that can give us some hope, Tony. And one is that let's take the example of those two books of mine that you mentioned, the Adam and Eve After the Pill books. A little over 10 years ago, when the first one was published, there was omerta on this subject from the general culture, from the secular media. The book was widely discussed in religious media, but not in the secular media because the idea
Mm,
of questioning the sexual revolution
mm,
was a radical idea at that time. And people didn't want to be sent off into the dunce corner for doing it. I understand that, but there's been a sea change. Now you have secular thinkers starting to question the same thing. And I
mm.
quote a couple of them in the footnotes of the second book, Adam and Eve After the Pill Revisited, which just came out last year. This is a very promising development. You have women in different countries, in the UK, in Germany, in France, in the United States, who are not identified with the religious right, who again are discussed in these footnotes,
Mm.
saying something's gone wrong. Something has happened to romance. We don't know exactly what it is, but we think that men are getting ideas about romance from pornography. That's not
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
We think that it's harder to hold on to or even find a good man in the first place, good being defined as one who wants to be committed. So you have secular women raising these questions. And I think that's very promising. So part of the answer is how will we recover these truths? We will recover them in part because people have been made miserable for generations now by living as if these truths did not exist. And what we are seeing, I think, are the very beginning of second thoughts. Second point, how will we recover these truths? Part of how we'll recover them again is a different kind of unhappiness that has resulted
mm,
since the 1960s and the sexual revolution became the way we live. This unhappiness has to do with nurture and specifically with the desire of women for children. In saying that, I don't mean that men don't also want children, but for women, I think it's a much more primal, a powerful, immediate desire that doesn't even need explanation. Perhaps for men, it helps to articulate why they want children. But for women, I think it's safe to say, no matter how controversial this statement might seem now, that most women want children. And there's social science evidence as well. Most women in surveys will say that they want children. By the way, they also say that they want marriage. But leaving marriage aside, women are finding it very difficult to have children. And I think that will, after these experiments of single parenthood, only childhood, et cetera, have run their course, I think, again, that a certain kind of unhappiness will force people to look around for other solutions. And in my own work, Tony, when I travel or speak to groups, I very often find that the most powerful event that forced a reconsideration on the part of individuals was seeing such a thing. In other words,
mm,
seeing at the park that woman with the three little children who's playing
mm,
with them and
mm,
having fun, or seeing the example of someone's home
mm,
where there are lots of people about. I mean, this is
mm,
partly a problem of arithmetic. We've subtracted so many people from our
mm,
lives
mm,
through abortion, through the shrinking of the family, through fatherlessness, and now through all of the obstacles that seem to be there in the way of marriage for many people.
mm,
But I am hopeful, Tony, because I think that this is a very unnatural way that we have come to live. And that's why it's important for listeners to understand that we're not
mm,
pointing fingers at people. We're not saying that you're a bad human being for the choices you might have made. We are saying, what has the accumulation of these choices in the direction of the sexual revolution
yeah,
meant for our societies and for individual happiness?
yeah,
I think if we approach the question that way, we will see where the correction will come from. It will come from individuals in possession of the idea that hey, maybe there's a better way of doing this.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that idea that it will come from individuals. There's no point in waiting for government. It turns out there's no point in waiting for the church. Most churches, anyway, the established ones. So it's going to come from the bottom up. It's going to come from people looking around and thinking, well, actually, I want some of that, which kind of emphasizes the role of people who are married to keep their marriages happily and almost to to be proud of what they've got, so people can see the benefits of living with Brad mentions the stats around the happiest people in the world are married with children statistically, and again, people should look on that and maybe get something from it. But although governments can't necessarily, we can't wait for them, as I said. Nevertheless, we live in a society in the UK, and I believe in the US as well, where it's no longer possible, or it's very, very hard to raise a family on one average income, because property's so expensive, everything else is so expensive, that it's almost like people feel, well, you've got to get two people going out to work. So then you've got, Erica Commissar's being there and the importance of that, replaced by daycare. It's a difficulty for people. And I'm wondering, as far as what governments can do to encourage things, what do you think we should be encouraging government to do to promote marriage and to promote more stability with families?
So I don't want to duck the question, Tony, but I am not in the policy end of things. But that
Right.
said, I think one of the things government can do, and I would extend this message to the churches, is
Yep.
to first of all stop pretending that all things are equal. They're not.
Yes.
Stop pretending that there isn't social good in marriage, in the union of a man and a woman who then have families.
Yep.
This is how human communities have been anchored. And again, to rely on anecdote, but anecdote is sometimes powerful. We all know people who did not have the good fortune of growing up in that kind of connected, stable family, but who found it in other families. In other words, the grounded children, we say grounded in the United States. I hope that's okay. This the stable, secure children of stable unions don't tend to go running to their friends' houses where anything goes. It's quite the opposite. It's the kids who have been cast off and don't have a place to go, who find in other families a vision of what they might have. And again, this is strictly anecdotal, but
Yeah.
it goes to the truth that societies cannot be stable without a critical mass of stable marriages and stable families. Everybody knows this, but governments fail to proclaim it. And even more than governments, the fact that the churches don't is just an enduring mystery to me, Tony. I talk about this in that second book, Adam and Eve After the Pill Revisited, because I cannot fathom why, when the churches are in possession of one of the most important truths in human history, which is that there's a man, there's a woman, and what they do as married people is elevated. It connects them to the divine in a way that nothing else does. Nothing else that human beings do, according to Christian teaching, connect us in quite the same way as the act of participating as man and woman, and later it is to be hoped in procreation. We're connected to the cosmos in this way, to God, to salvation. This is an incredibly ennobling message, and Christianity is in possession of it. And you would not know that from stepping into most churches. So one can only surmise that Christian leaders, for the most part, have decided to soft pedal this teaching because they don't want to give offense. But what they need to understand, and what our Western governments need to understand, is that this is exactly the message that could change people's lives for the good.
Yep.
And even if it didn't, this is the message that will keep our societies strong instead of being riven and divisive and inhuman the way we are today and in certain places. I don't want to catastrophize, but I think anybody over the age of 30 say, would understand that politics has gotten more acrimonious, society has gotten less forgiving, and in general, a lot of people seem to be at each other's throats. Why has this happened? I happen to think the waning of Christianity in the West has a lot to do with it, but so does the fact that we are losing that stable base that kept things
Yep.
sane
Yep.
and neighborly. We're losing the stable base of married, stable families, which again goes to why your work is so important in the coalition, because without that kind of work, what are we going to look like 20 years from now?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And it's very interesting you mentioned that, because I found it interesting comments from Richard Dawkins, Professor Richard Dawkins, recently, who was talking about Christianity. While he still believes there is no God, and he still doesn't have any faith, he can see the value in the framework of Christianity for society all of a sudden. And because it turns out that when the steamship of Christianity leaves the dock of society, it isn't replaced by liberalism, because liberalism has nothing to offer. It gets replaced by another religion, whether it be the religion of identity politics and self-ID, or another religion. But the fact is, it doesn't revert to just some kind of lovely classical liberalism. It doesn't seem to be the case. And so from that point of view, people like him and more people these days are saying just what you're saying. Actually, we think that framework is really good. Now, you and I would be Christians, my board are Christians, but we approach it from a secular evidence base. Most of our supporters would be Christians, but many of them aren't. They're secularists, they're atheists even, and they would say yes, but we still see that this thing that marriage does to society is really, really healthy. The idea of one man and one woman, the idea of aiming at it for a lifetime, the idea of monogamy, it results in an ordered society that prospers. And indeed, we know from research looking at other societies and people like J.D. Unwin, etc., that when cultures leave those things, well, they begin to languish, and they haven't got long before they cease to exist.
Yes, so several thoughts about that, Tony. First, I want to say that was exactly what got me involved in this work in the first place. That is this desire to examine the sexual revolution and its effects. What got me involved was 20 years ago, starting to see trends that are much discussed now. For example, the rise in psychiatric problems among children, the rise in loneliness among young people and old people, and the rise in unhappiness among women. This has been well documented. It's one of the most fascinating social science phenomena of the last 20 years. Why are women less happy now than they used to be? I think you and I suspect the answer, but suspicion isn't enough. The social science goes to show it. So it was this conviction that the common denominator here was living the post-sexual revolutionary life, that this is what has given rise to these problems. This is what I'm trying to trace out in the books. Now, about Richard Dawkins, it's fascinating, isn't it? I have to give him credit, of course, for understanding what's been central about Christianity anchoring Western society. And it's too bad that more people don't understand the same thing. On the other hand, and this goes out to your listeners who may be secular or atheist, here to me is the paradox. Richard Dawkins and many people like him who appreciate what religion does for society don't seem to understand that in the case of Christianity, the self-sacrificing that goes into marriage has a model there, which is, in the case of Christianity, Jesus Christ. Christians are taught to sacrifice. They are taught that this is the most important form of love. They are taught that all love, period, is self-sacrificing. And I don't say that to pat the Christians on the back. I say that to point out that it's not obvious to me that one can take the theological roots of the kind of sacrifice we're talking about, dig them up, and throw them into the ocean without society suffering as a result. In other words, there seems to be uh, just a connection between the kind of sacrifice to which Christians are called, and not only Christians, people of other faiths as well, but to get the connection between that kind of sacrifice and the sacrifice that goes into marriage, that goes into sitting by the bedside of your 85-year-old wife when no one else will, and she's been ill for 10 years. That's a beautiful thing. That is a kind of sacrifice that we cannot expect of people who have not been trained up in this. And I'm not saying there aren't heroic, say, atheist couples who don't live this way, but they are heroic because that's not the norm for them. Whereas Christians are taught this from their mother's knee, it's to be hoped, or when they convert. And so, in short, I applaud Richard Dawkins for his understanding, which is true, of what Christianity has given to the West. And yet I wonder, in fact, I don't wonder, I'm sure, that those two things, the theology and the sociology, can't be pulled apart quite as easily as people like Dawkins want them to be.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think it's hard to expect the framework without the faith, because one is the glue or the bolts that holds the other together, really. And you know, because people are fundamentally selfish, it turns out, and without the kind of appeal to something higher, they won't do what they're called to do to hold that thing together. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I'll just ask you another question then, really. In terms of what we should be aiming for as the Coalition for Marriage, should we be looking at repealing laws around same-sex marriage and identifying man-woman marriage as separate and unique? Should we be looking at repealing other laws around Gender Recognition Act, which says that if a man thinks he's a woman and two doctors agree, he can have a new birth certificate, which rewrites history? Or should we be looking at Marriage 2.0? And actually something which says, no, that's lost, that's gone. We need something different and distinct and separate. And I'm thinking of that in the context of things, especially like the surrogacy debate, which is going on, where we've got, in many instances, legalized child trafficking, where people who wouldn't otherwise be able to have children, whether it be people on their own or same-sex couples or whatever, can employ other people to produce children for them. And the whole concept of family seems to have gone. So do we recover it by trying to pull laws back and repeal them, or do we recover it by trying to come up with something fresh and new?
I think we recover the idea of marriage by approaching each of these issues from a humanitarian point of view. So, for example, about the same-sex marriage, which is settled law across the West, which doesn't mean that it's a good thing. But what I would question is what it means to a child to have been purposely deprived of a mother or purposely deprived of a father. And we need to use those words, purposely deprived, because the idea that men and women are interchangeable units, especially when it comes to children, not only countermands common sense, but is increasingly obvious in the social science. And it resonates with what people know. In almost no households with babies does excuse me, does the father wake up in the middle of the night to feed the baby? This is just common sense. But in the case of unions where children are acquired who are specifically, excuse me, who are explicitly deprived of mother love or father love by the law and with the acclamation of society, I think it's past time to point to those events and say, this isn't fair to the child. So that is what I think all of us should say when we look at the example of children acquired in this way and deprived in this way. As for the question of transgender, again, Christian charity requires our understanding that when you look at the medical literature on people who end up with these surgeries or in these gender clinics, one can only feel for them because typically there's a long history of pathologies, of cutting, of anorexia, of psychological disturbances of all kinds. Very often there is trauma in the background, including sexual trauma, typically sexual assault at an early age. And I think in this particular case, if no other, we can start having some confidence that the laws of our societies are trimming back and saying, wait a minute, wait a minute, this experiment has gone too far. And when we confront these things in the public square, I think we make that argument again with compassion, with humanitarianism. People are not happy. These experiments are not leaving people happy. And if the counter argument is, well, they say they're happy, what do you say to that? We can say, well, there is just certain transactions between human beings that should not happen in principle. Slavery being the obvious example. Perhaps there were happy slaves. I wouldn't want to make that argument in public. But the point is that there are certain things that human beings do at their peril to themselves. And we should, as a society, and we should within our churches, stand up and say, oh, we shouldn't do these things. Um, the vast majority of people in Western societies are not in those two categories of same-sex relationships or transgenderism. The vast majority are men and women who, again, because of a kind of forgetting that is not their fault, that was not done by them, may even have been done by their grandparents, but who have lost track of things that once seemed obvious. How do you get to be happy in life? Well, your best shot is to find someone who loves you and stays with you and when you've lost your looks, when you're ill, when catastrophe strikes, who wants to have a family with you. And how do you get that? Well, pledging monogamy seems to be the best way to do that in Western societies.
Yeah.
And this is what needs to be retaught to these, especially people in their 20s and 30s who are so manifestly unhappy in various ways. But Tony, I conclude, having spent a long time trying to popularize the social science research on all of this, because it's clear that the number of people out there who are going to be moved by the social science is vanishingly small. That is, the number of people who will actually be persuaded by rational argument is not enough to take us to a better society. What we need to do is show by example and show by the size of our hearts, really, that we mean it, that we are concerned about the unhappiness that Western people have brought upon themselves and upon their children and upon their communities, unwittingly in most cases, but still really. And the hope is that in holding up other examples, like the work that you do, showing people what it looks like to be married and to look forward to an old age in which one is protected and surrounded by loving faces is as close as we can get to happiness or a shot at happiness in this life.
Do you know, I think that's a wonderful point to leave it there. I think it's a very positive thing, you know, that there's a happiness that comes from marriage and from growing old and having kids and grandkids, which can't be replaced with anything else. And it can't be bought and it can't be imagined. And it's unique and it's special and it's a real privilege to all who've got it. And they should really show it so others seek after it sooner and in larger numbers. Absolutely wonderful thought to finish with. Mary, where can people follow you? If you've got a blog, where can people go? We'll put it up on the screen so they can keep pace with you.
Oh, thank you, Tony. The best place to go is my website, maryeberstadt.com. It has
Great.
information about the books and appearances and et cetera. And we'll put the podcast up as soon as we get it as well.
Great. And a warm encouragement to everyone to go and buy those two wonderful books, Adam and Eve After the Pill and Eve After the Pill Revisited, both really contributory and essential books, key reading for these sorts of subjects. Mary, keep up the great work. It's such a joy to talk to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Tony. I've enjoyed it immensely, and let's hope it does some good. Thank you.